Hello, and welcome to my podcast, Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations, and through these discussions, you will learn why the majority of the time, the book wins. Having said that, I am a huge movie buff, and do give unbiased reviews for both the book and the movie, ultimately. So whether you love books, movies, or both, this is the perfect podcast for you. This probably goes without saying, but there will be spoilers for both the book and the movie in this episode. So if you plan on reading the book or watching the movie, go do that first and then come back and listen to this. And now, without further ado, let's get right into it. Hi, welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you tuned in to this episode, and I hope by listening I can bring a little misery into your day, because that is what we were talking about today. Misery by Stephen King, published in 1987, and then the movie Misery, directed by Rob Reiner, released in 1990. And I want to start by saying happy birthday to Stephen King. I read this book at the start of the month, not realizing King's birthday was just a few weeks away. When I was looking into him after finishing the book, I saw his birthday was soon, and I knew I had to release this on the same day. So I usually release podcasts on Wednesday, but I bumped it up a day so it would be on his birthday. I was going to get more into Stephen King as a person and as a writer and just share different facts about him. However, I ended up having a lot to say about this book and movie, and so there just wasn't really time. I will, however, be posting YouTube videos that are author spotlights, and Stephen King will probably be the first I talk about, so stay tuned for that video. I won't be releasing it as a podcast, it will just be a YouTube video. So make sure you subscribe to my channel so you can see when that gets uploaded. So I had never read this book before, but I had watched the movie. I saw it when I was around 11 years old. My dad had a coworker who referred to the Mr. Man part of the movie. And I guess I should mention my maiden name is Mann, so that was my dad's last name. But so the coworker referenced this to my dad, but he had never heard of the movie, and so we later rented it and watched it as a family. Watching movies was often a family event, but it is kind of funny that we gathered around to watch a movie such as this. Even though it's been almost 20 years since I have seen this, I still remembered the more memorable scenes, but there was still a lot I didn't remember though. But for some reason, despite having liked this movie, I hadn't watched it a second time until just the other day. And one of the reasons I chose this Stephen King book in particular was because I read that King said that Annie is a representation of addiction, which King overcame in the 80s. It doesn't say what year exactly, but sometime in the 80s. So I thought this just gave the story a whole new look, and reading it with that in mind was an interesting perspective. So I will be focusing on that aspect of it quite a bit, because I find it interesting and I have a personal connection to that. If that side of things doesn't intrigue you as much, it's still worth listening to this podcast because I, of course, talk about all the other aspects of the book and movie, and there are quite a few differences between the two. So especially if you're someone who likes the movie but hasn't read the book, you should for sure listen because there's a lot that's different. So my thoughts on the book. I have read a handful of Stephen King books. Maybe not a handful. I've read 4 or something. Though I haven't read any of his scarier horror stuff. But this so far has been my favorite for sure. I was really surprised at how much I loved it. It just went into what was going on in Paul's head in such vivid detail. It also just feels so vulnerable and open. The emotions and thoughts that Paul goes through as he is tormented by this woman who degrades him in so many ways, mentally, emotionally, and of course physically. This book also focused on the writing process more than I expected. I hadn't expected that at all. But that was cool because I enjoyed that. It talks about the process, but also just the magic of it and what it can do, what it can mean to a writer. When I was about a quarter of the way through, I was worried I was going to start to lose interest, but that never ended up happening. Things didn't plateau. It just kept getting more and more interesting. And about halfway, things got just even more out of hand, and there starts to be a scariness to it at that point. And then there are 3 especially disturbing scenes, one of which is burned in my mind, and I fear I will never be able to forget, but we will get into those details later. The ending of this book was also just so perfect, and I actually cried twice. I don't know, I wasn't bawling, but I definitely got teary twice in this book. So I just highly recommend it, especially if you are a writer. I think you'll enjoy how much he talks about writing. And if you're someone who has struggled with addiction, I think you would appreciate that aspect of it for sure. But be warned, because it is intense and it is more gruesome than the movie. The more violent scenes, though, are more just like an afterthought when I think back on it, because what stands out about the book the most is Paul and how he's able to save himself in more ways than one. So overall, it's really just such an inspirational novel about believing in yourself and overcoming and escaping whatever is holding you back. And onto the movie. To start, I want to mention that the script writer for this movie is William Goldman. If his name sounds familiar, it's because he has written the scripts for some huge movies such as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Princess Bride, Papillon, Chaplin, Dreamcatcher, which is another Stephen King, as well as the Stepford Wives, which was the topic of my first ever podcast, so that one has a special place in my heart. The director is Rob Reiner, which caught me by surprise. I associate him more with comedy, but when I was looking into him, he's actually done a fair amount of dramas. He directed Stand By Me before this, and that's also an adaptation of a Stephen King story. It's an adaptation of the short story, The Body. King loved Reiner's adaptation so much that he signed over the rights to Misery with the caveat that Reiner must be the one to direct. And when King has been asked what his 5 favorite adaptations are, he mentions both Misery and Stand By Me, so that's quite the praise for Reiner. People questioned Reiner's desire to direct a film such as this due to, because he had been known for something more lighthearted, but he replied saying, "It's important for me to find my way into the film. As you will see, the movie is about a man who is trapped by his own success and is desperately trying to break out and establish himself in a different way. I felt very much those feelings when I finished All in the Family." Onto acting, we have Kathy Bates, who plays Annie, and at this point, can you really imagine anyone else in this role? She had been in Hollywood for almost 20 years before getting the role of Annie Wilkes, and this role won her an Oscar and a Golden Globe, and now she's become a household name and has been in so many amazing movies and has been in so many shows. So she's just an incredible actress. James Caan was cast as Paul after the role was turned down by countless actors. Apparently, most actors didn't want the role because they felt like the character of Paul was overshadowed by Annie. And then Warren Beatty was attached to it at one point, but he said that the Hobbling Scene made Paul look like a loser for the rest of the movie. And all this is just so annoying, these dumb macho male actors who want the spotlight to themselves. And I can't help but wonder if the fact that it is a woman in the bigger role that was something they didn't like. And Beatty thinking that Paul looks like a loser after getting hobbled, that just makes his escape all the more impressive, seeing a character be humiliated and literally tortured only to overcome against all odds certainly does not make that character look like a loser. Ultimately, I'm glad Beatty turned the role down though, because I don't know, I just find him and his acting too pretentious, and I don't think he could have pulled it off at all. But James Caan, on the other hand, is amazing, and he's great in this, and I think it is one of his more notable roles. And when asked about people recognizing him, he said, "Look, you only pray that when you start in this business that you get to a point where people recognize you or quote you. I mean, I've got a lot of people who are like, 'Hey, your ankle okay?' I get that a lot. It's harmless. It's great. First of all, it means that they remember the picture. There's nothing not to like about it. No, I hope they never stop." So it sounds like he, is grateful for the notoriety this movie brought him. I mean, he was famous before this, but yeah. And then I wanted to mention Richard Farnsworth, who is cast as Buster the Sheriff, a role that didn't exist in the book. The book is entirely from Paul's perspective, but in the movie we see what's going on with the local sheriff as well. And I recognize this actor from the Anne of Green Gable movies, and when I looked into him after watching this movie, there was a lot of interesting things to learn. For starters, he was a stuntman for 30 years before getting into acting. And he also has been nominated for 2 Oscars, once in 1979 for Best Supporting Actor in Come a Horseman, which happens to star James Caan. Then again in 1999 for the leading role in The Straight Story, which was directed by David Lynch. And sadly, in 1999, Farnsworth had been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and the following year he committed suicide by shooting himself. Before he died, Richard Ebert asked him what his proudest movie achievement was, and he said that it was that he had been in 60 movies and never said a single cuss word, which is pretty impressive. So, to get into the details of the book and movie, I will start with Annie Wilkes herself. In the movie, when Annie brings Paul home, she leads him to believe that she will take him to the hospital once the roads are cleared and will use her phone to call his agent and his family once the phone lines are back up. But then, as things go along, we find out that she is lying, and realizes she is more than just his number one fan. She is a psychopath. In the book, Paul realizes Annie is crazy, like literally right away. And this surprised me because I was expecting more of a build-up, but King just gets right to it, showing that Paul does not trust her and sees right away how unstable she is. In the movie, Paul is there for about 4 weeks, but in the book, he's there for like 5 or 6 months. So he endures so much more in the book than he did in the movie, partly because he was just there for so much longer. In both, Paul comes across her photo album, which contains newspaper clippings, and this is how we learn about her past. The movie shows that she had killed her dad, a roommate, and then moved on to hospital patients, at first elderly people, and then babies. In the book, she also set fire to an apartment building they were living in, which led to the deaths of the family that had been in the apartment below them. And she had also picked up a hitchhiker shortly before Paul, whom she had killed. The book has a scene where she comes into his room during the night holding a rat in a rat trap. The rat isn't dead yet, and she takes it out and kills it, and she calls it poor, poor thing, killing it to put it out of its misery. In the book, he reads she killed patients who were on their deathbeds, seeing them as poor, poor things. And then the book says, and then she begun killing the healthy along with the damaged. He supposed that in her deepening psychotic spiral, she had begun to see all of them as poor, poor things. And then there's another line that says how she saw people in 3 groups: brats, poor, poor things, and herself. So she kills people either because they are brats or like disappoint her in some way, or because she views them as poor things, like a rat in a trap. And despite all of what Annie puts Paul through, she is constantly guilt-tripping him and being very manipulative about how he should be grateful because she saved his life, saying things like, "You owe me your life, Paul. I hope you'll remember that. I hope you keep that in mind." And she has major mood swings and at times is seemingly kind. In one of these moments it reads, Paul thought that the occasional moments like this were the most ghastly of all, because in them he saw the woman she might have been if her upbringing had been right, or the drug squirted out by all the funny little glands inside her head had been less wrong. And Kathy Bates added her own backstory to Annie as a way to understand the character. In her mind, Annie was sexually abused by her father, which is why she killed him and why she went crazy. But as we will get into, Annie is a representation of addiction, not like a mental illness per se. And so when you think of her in the context of addiction, her actions make sense. Also in the book, Annie will do self-harm, like scratching herself so deep she bleeds, but this isn't in the movie. The book and movie show she gets depressed when it starts raining, but what the movie doesn't show is that during that time she binges on various foods, but specifically sweet food. When she leaves, because she says she shouldn't be around him when she's in this mood, he escapes while she's gone out of the room, and he sees what a mess the entire house is. Like there's just dirty dishes stacked up everywhere and food all over the place, and rats are upstairs getting into the trash. And the book talks about the blankness in her eyes, and I think Bates did a great job capturing that look. And by the way, Bates had read the book before being cast and she loved it, but James Caan has never read the book, which seems crazy to me. On to addiction. As I read this book, I highlighted so many sections which show the similarities between Annie and addiction. When you have an addiction or someone you love who struggles with addiction, it is helpful to think of it as a separate person. And people in recovery will write letters to their addiction, like breaking up with it, kind of telling it why it can't be in their life anymore. And this book almost feels like that it was that for Stephen King, like his way of overpowering and killing his addiction. From what I've read, this isn't what he intended when starting the book, but the story just kind of began going a different route than planned, and the book ended up being something quite different, and in my opinion, more powerful than he had originally thought it would be. So he got the idea for this while he was on the Concorde, where he was hit with the idea of just this solid mass of a woman who names her pet pig after her favorite character from a novel. He then planned for the author to be held hostage by said woman, who forces him to write her a book. The original title was going to be the Annie Wilkes edition, and in the end she was going to kill the writer. However, while writing, King said that Paul ended up being far more resilient than he had thought he would be. So the book also evolved into being a metaphor for addiction. After refusing to speak about his motivations for writing Misery for almost 2 decades, Stephen King finally came out and stated that it is indeed about his battle with substance abuse. Kathy Bates' character is a representation of his dependency on drugs and what it did to his body, making him feel alone and separated from everything, while hobbling any attempts he made at an escape. In his statement, he said he did not come out with it at the time because he was not ready, and because he was afraid it would detract from the story. Before getting into the addiction parallels, I want to say that I don't mean to come across as demonizing alcohol per se. I know there are people that can take it or leave it, and it isn't a big deal for them. Some people just have something in their genetics that make them predispositioned to be addicts. Then there's others who form a dependency on drugs or alcohol for just, one reason or another. And the perspective I and King give is as someone who is familiar with what addiction can do to a person. If you are someone who has some kind of background in it in one way or another, I'm sure you will be able to relate. If you don't have any experience with addiction, then you can listen to this and gain some perspective and understanding of it. So I'm going to start with the title, Misery. What this brought to mind is a phrase that is used for describing the addiction experience, and that is magic, medicine, misery. So King was addicted to drugs, and he specifically mentions cocaine, but for the sake of this podcast, I'm going to use alcohol as an example. When a person is drinking, it feels like magic. Everything is brighter, they have more fun, it's more exciting. And then it gets to the point where they must drink. If an alcoholic tries to quit cold turkey, they can have a seizure. So then the substance, the alcohol, literally is medicine at that point. Then it gets to the point where it's just pure misery and they keep drinking because they're trapped in the addiction, even though it is no longer magic, and they are just miserable but stuck and have a hard time escaping. Another line that I thought seemed symbolic of a substance is when Annie rescues him and is giving him mouth to mouth. He talks about what a terrible taste and smell it was, saying, "It brought back the memory of her sour breath blowing down his throat like a dirty wind from hell." So it seems pretty similar to drinking alcohol. He's literally talking about it going down his throat and ingesting it. There's also a lot of talk about Annie nearly killing him, whether on purpose or accident. One section says, "It might have just been one of those things which happened, but he later came to suspect that she had nearly killed him with an accidental overdose. She didn't know as much about what she was doing as she believed she did." That was only one of the things about Annie that scared him. So drugs and alcohol are unpredictable and aren't easily controlled, so you can therefore die very easily from it. It also talks about how she doesn't have a good grasp on time and forgets to turn the calendar and doesn't know what day it is, which in turn causes Paul to not know what day it is, or how much time has passed up until the last month or so. He starts keeping track. And then he also talks about things in Annie's head just dropping out, metaphorically speaking, she just quickly forgets things, as well as about how he never knows what to expect from her. 2 different lines read, "When you live in the funhouse, the laugh riot just never stopped." And then later, "Just another day lost in the funhouse with Annie." When you're dealing with addiction, you just never know what to expect, and it gets to the point where almost nothing is a surprise. Then there are the problems that addiction causes and the mess it makes. Annie will break something or spill something or kill someone, and she manipulates Paul by telling him, "But remember that you made that mess, not me. It's nobody's fault but your own." And Paul does truly feel guilt about getting the attention of the cop, which causes Annie to kill him, even though he isn't truly to blame because Annie is the one who did it. And then there is the fact that he depends on Annie, and he does need her in a way. She cares for him, she brings him his pills, feeds him, dresses his wounds, which she is later the cause of, which is also similar to addiction. And 2 lines I like are, "She was crazy, but he needed her." And then later, he's talking to her and he says, "I sort of depend on you, And she replies, "Yes, you do, don't you, Paul?" So the addict needs the substance, just as Paul needs Annie as a way to get relief from the pain. And like I said, it also gets to a point where it just is medicine. Like I said, I highlighted a lot of sections that I felt reflected addiction, so I'm just going to list a few and try to go through them, not take too long doing it. So the first quote, "Neither is she stupid, as I think we have both agreed. I think that she is filled with herself. She does not just have a large ego, but one which is positively grandiose, might have alternating periods of deep depression and almost aggressive cheerfulness and hilarity. The puffed and infected ego underlay all, positive that all eyes were upon her, positive that she was starring in a great drama. The outcome was a thing for which untold millions waited with held breath." So addiction can be very prideful. And this reminds me of Jonathan in the podcast I did for Being Flynn, where he just had these delusions of grandeur, whatever that phrase is. And it's because there's the underlying insecurity, and that causes them to therefore think these prideful things of themselves as a way to mask this deep insecurity they have. And this line also shows the major mood swings that addiction causes. And then the other line, "Fact is, you're getting worse, Annie, aren't you? A little worse every day." People often refer to addiction as a progressive disease, meaning that it gets worse and worse. If you keep with it, it doesn't just plateau or something. The disease and the consequences from it just get worse and worse. And suddenly, for just a moment, he thought of saying, "All right, Annie, go ahead. Let's just call it off," meaning to kill them both. Then his need and will to live, and there was still quite a lot of each in him, rose up and clamoured the momentary weakness away. Addiction can often lead to suicide. So many people might get close, but then their desire to live will suddenly awake and clamor the momentary weakness away. Having said that, there are a lot of suicides that occur to that. Then he stared at her, groggy but appalled. He didn't know how to answer her. It was so paranoid, so crazy. This is just showing that you can't have a logical conversation when addiction is involved. It makes no sense, it's paranoid, and it's crazy. And then, now he thought, unbending it and holding it in his right hand, "You will not shake. Hold that thought. You will not shake." When you haven't gotten your fix, an addict will get shaky, and those shakes can turn into a seizure. If you talk to addicts or alcoholics, they can all relate to, waking up in the morning and their hands being so shaky they can't do anything until they've had some drinks. Next one, he could see in her skittery eyes how frightened she had been and still was, how close he had come to dying. She was taking extravagant care of him, although Annie never said so. He believed that she filled in the ends either as another evidence of her solicitude. "How can you say I was cruel to you, Paul, when I filled in all those ends?" Or as an act of atonement, or possibly even a quasi-superstitious rite. Enough bandage changes, enough sponge baths, enough ends filled in, and Paul would live. So this just showing the pendulum that is addiction, terrible at one moment and seemingly comforting the next. Also, so willing to do all the things helpful, yet not willing to do the one thing that matters more than anything else. There's a quote I read from a recovering addict that said, "I would have died for my kids, but I couldn't stop drinking for them." So Annie will do all these things for Paul, yet can't do the one thing he needs, which is to let him go. And then our last one, feeling angry at her was better than feeling scared of her. He tried to hold on to the anger because the anger made him feel brave. A brave man could think. A coward couldn't. Addiction makes you scared and hopeless, and hopelessness is what precedes anger because we want to feel a sense of power because fear has taken away our sense of power. So we turn to anger as a way to feel more in control. So moving on to another aspect of this book, which is just like the smaller ways that seemingly smaller ways that she just, degrades him and humiliates him. One of the things I loved about this book was the realness of it, for lack of a better word. Paul is put in such vulnerable and embarrassing situations, and at one point, when he doesn't yet have a wheelchair, Annie leaves for over 2 days. Not only is the pain unbearable, but he also is super thirsty. At one point, he urinates and tries to get some of it in his cupped hands, which he then tries to drink, and it says, he would never tell anyone about that, assuming he ever got out of this, and he supposed he might try to lie to himself, but he would never be able to believe the lie. And he brings this up at another point as well about, just the embarrassing, humiliating things that happened that he will try to convince himself didn't happen. And I just don't think the movie really captured this aspect. There are times when he will beg Annie, but it didn't come across like that he was as scared of her, and he wasn't as desperate and degraded as he was in the book. In the book, he also cries frequently. There are times when he begins to cry over something more minor, but that's what trauma does to you. You can be set off emotionally by something that normally wouldn't be that big a deal. There is also a section which says, he could hear the first evening crickets tuning up in Annie's field. He thought, I heard the same sound as a small, unhurt boy, and for a moment he nearly wept. Another scene similar to this is when he gives her $400 that he had in his wallet. Holding the wallet and the money, he's reminded of when he was at the bank and the plans he's had for this money and just how his life was so normal then before all this happened. And then he suddenly realizes he is crying. And this is also a reflection of addiction when you spend the last of your money on whatever substance, even though doing so brings you pain and sadness and misery because you don't want to be at that point in your life, yet you feel stuck. When he gets the courage to leave the room and later attempt to kill Annie, it says, he thought later that the world and its unfailing perversity would probably construe those things which he did next as acts of heroism, and he would probably let them. But in fact, what he did was nothing more than a final staggering grab for self-preservation. So there are several things in the books that she does to him that aren't much compared to when she hobbles him, but are those smaller ways that she degrades him, and they aren't in the movie. For example, she makes him drink from a cleaning bucket which has soap and filthy residue. She also puts a gag in his mouth when she sees a cop driving up, and the rag that she puts in his mouth had a cleaning product on it, which makes him vomit. Then later she locks him in the basement overnight where it is pitch black and there's rats and he's scared. In the movie, he has more attitude with her, like including flipping her off when she waves at him. Whereas in the book, like there's a few times where he tries to assert himself, but she always gets back at him in some way or another. And he would never have flipped her off in the book because he was too scared of her and what she would do in return. And then some other quotes that I thought were just really powerful and show this. And of all she had done to him, this resignation was surely a symptom of the worst. She had turned him into a pain-racked animal with no moral options at all. He was aware that the horizons of his interest had shrunk, but he accepted this as the price of survival. It was a genuine wonder he had survived at all. Had he known, before this, had he really known how badly she had cowed him or how much his essential self she had scraped away? He knew how constantly she had terrorized him, but did he know how much of his own subjective reality, once so strong he had taken it for granted, had been erased? And then, I guess we should get to the hobbling scene, which is what the movie is most notorious for, I would say. In both, she starts with a line about what people did to workers in mines who were caught stealing. So she says, if they caught them, they made sure that they could go on working, but they also made sure that they would never run again. The operation was called hobbling, Paul, and that is what I'm going to do to you. For my safety, and yours as well. In the movie, she puts a block between his ankles and then smashes them against the block using a sledgehammer. Yes, this scene is intense, and it's well done on both sides, the acting. And when watching for the first time, it definitely stands out, and it's just become like everybody is aware of this scene, you know? However, after reading the book, this scene doesn't really seem that bad. Yeah, things are just more gruesome in the book. And this scene, for starters, so she had been gone, and then he wakes up during the night, and he sees her pulling a needle out of his arm, and she's talking to him, and she mentions giving him a pre-op shot. And when he hears this, he can't pay attention to what else she's saying because he's freaked out about what she means by pre-op shot, meaning pre-operation. And this scene is also when he is trying to get the knife under the mattress, and then she pulls it out and reveals she has found it. And as I was reading this, my adrenaline was pumping. And then the climax of the scene takes place when she picks up an axe, which he hadn't been able to previously see, and then she chops off his foot, then burns the stump to stop the bleeding. And when this happens, it says, and before his mind was completely consumed in a forest fire of panic, he understood that when this was over, she would have only the vaguest memories of what she had done. And of course, she tells him once again not to blame her and that it's his own fault. Paul says how he tries to forget that night but can't, because writers remember everything, Paul, especially the hurts. Strip a writer to the buff, point to the scars, and he'll tell you the story of each small one. From the big ones, you get novels, not amnesia. Now, as if this isn't bad enough, we are then moved ahead like 3 weeks, and Paul is just talking about what those weeks had been like. He and Annie had gotten into a routine, and she would wheel the TV into his room at night, and they would watch an episode of MASH together. And she would also roll his wheelchair out on the back porch during the day so he could enjoy the fresh air and the sunshine. Because remember, he was there for like 5 months. So he gets there in like January or February, but by this time it's like May, June, and so it's warmer outside. So despite the previous insanity with the hobbling, they had gotten into a comfortable rhythm, considering. And he says something about her being outside and waving, and then he waves back. And he says that he waves back with his hand that's missing a thumb. And when I read this line, like I thought I missed something. Like what? Like, did I miss what happened to his thumb? What's going on here? But then it goes back in time as he reflects and explaining what happened. But basically, she just went crazy about something minor as usual and cut off his thumb. So having 2 parts of his body removed is of course incredibly traumatizing. And at one point she enters his room and he is thinking, please, Annie, like if you're going to kill me, just do it. Just please don't cut off any more of me. And hobbling in this way can also be symbolic of addiction and how it cripples you and you are hobbled by it. Onto the basement scene. So in the movie, she briefly puts him in the basement when she sees Buster, the sheriff, approaching. It is daylight, so being in the basement, it's not really that big of a deal for the most part. However, in the book, she puts him down there at night and doesn't leave a light on. She has to drive the young trooper's car away to hide, and so she'll be gone until later the next day. She can't risk him trying to escape, and she says she has no choice but to keep him in the basement, and he begs her not to, or to at least leave a light on for him. Cover the windows then, he yelled after her. Use some pieces of sheet, or paint them black, or Christ, Annie, the rats. She was on the 3rd stair. She paused, looking at him from those dusty dime eyes. I haven't time to do any of those things, she said. and the rats won't bother you anyway. They may even recognize you for one of their own, Paul. They may adopt you." Annie laughed. She climbed the stairs, laughing harder and harder. There was a click as the lights went out, and Annie went on laughing, and he told himself he wouldn't scream, he wouldn't beg, that he was past all that. But the damp wildness of the shadows and the boom of her laughter were too much, and he shrieked for her not to do this to him, not to leave him. But she only went on laughing, and there was a click as the door was shut, and her laughter was muted, but her laughter was still there. Her laughter was on the other side of the door, where there was light. And then the lock clicked, and then another door closed, and her laughter was even more muted, but still there. And another lock clicked, and a bolt slammed, and her laughter was going away, her laughter was outside. And even after she had started the cruiser up, backed out, put the chains across the driveway, and driven away, he thought he could still hear her. He thought he could still hear her laughing and laughing and laughing. In the pitch dark, he is haunted by images of the young trooper that she had killed. And one section reads, "Only it wasn't the rats he was afraid of, was it? No, it was the trooper. His so vivid imagination rarely gave him the horrors, but when it did, God help him. God help him once it warmed up, and it was not only warmed up now, it was hot and running on full choke. That there was no sense at all, and what he was thinking made not a whit of difference in the dark. In the dark, rationality seemed stupid and logic a dream. In the dark, he thought with his skin." And I can relate to that section so well, and this is why I stopped watching and reading horror years ago. I used to love watching them. You get that adrenaline rush when you watch something, really scary. But every time after, like in the evening when I went to bed, I would just feel so terrified. And it didn't matter that I knew whatever I feared didn't exist, because in the dark, rationality seemed stupid and logic a dream. In the dark, I thought with my skin. Honestly, even this book was pushing it for me as far as scariness goes, because as a result of reading it, I did have a couple nights where I just could feel that fear. Like, I know that whatever I'm scared of isn't there, but even so, the fear can just feel so real. And so that's why I don't watch or read anything like super scary, because it's not worth it for me personally. I know some people just aren't, it doesn't bother them, but it definitely got to me. But anyway, this is a key scene because in both book and movie, while in the basement, he sees the grill, which she made him burn his book on. And by the way, in the movie, the book he burns is Untitled, but in the book, his book had been called Fast Cars. Anyway, and while he's down there, he steals the lighter fluid, and, he steals it and puts it in his pants in both. And speaking of the manuscript she made him burn, in the movie, James Caan does a great job showing how much that manuscript means to him and how painful it is to burn it. In the book, we get into even more detail about how much work went into writing it, and it said that it was a result of his labor pains, like comparing it to a child in some ways. And something that caught me by surprise with this book was how much it is about writing. Like, he talks about the process, but also just how writing is its own addiction and an escape. And he forces him to write Misery's Return, but little does she know, this ends up saving his life in multiple ways. When he is in the world of his character Misery Chastain, he can escape Annie and escape his predicament. And there is a great section that says, "After a while, Annie turned off the vacuum cleaner and stood in the doorway watching him. Paul had no idea she was there, had no idea, in fact, that he was there. He had finally escaped. He was in the little Dunthorpe's churchyard, breathing damp night air and smelling moss and earth and mist. He heard the clock in the tower of the Presbyterian church strike 2 and dumped it into the story without missing a beat. When it was very good, he could see through the paper. He could see through it now. Annie was watching him for a long time, her heavy face unsmiling, moveless. After a while, she went away. Her tread was heavy, but Paul didn't hear that either." And then there's another part where, he has been writing and he's feeling more powerful because of it, and even Annie can sense it. And it says, "Amused," he thought. "She felt the heat. I think she's afraid to get too close in case I might burn her." And I like that section because Paul's writing puts him on another plane, and someone as evil as Annie, you just can't touch it. Annie, despite being his #1 fan, has no interest in learning how a book is written and just thinks of him as having this magical talent and not recognizing the work that goes into it and the power that comes from creating something. And when trying to figure out how to bring the character Misery back to life, which, for those who don't know, he had killed off his character Misery in his most recent book, and Annie is so attached to the character of Misery that she is forcing him to write a new book where he brings her back to life. So he's trying to figure out how he can realistically bring her back. And he talks about a game they played as kids called Can You, where you had to get a character out of a seemingly impossible situation. The paragraph reads, "Can I? Yeah, you bet I can. There's a million things in the world I can't do. Can't hit a curveball even back in high school. Can't fix a leaky faucet. Can't roller skate or make an F chord on a guitar sound like anything but shit. I've tried twice to be married and I couldn't do that either. But if you want me to take you away, to scare you or involve you or make you cry or grin, yeah, I can. I can bring it to you and keep bringing it until you holler uncle. I am able. I can. And I love this section so much because he believes in himself, and writing just gives him that confidence he wouldn't have had otherwise in that situation. And it just gives him this power and that heat that was referenced earlier. And then there's also a section where he talks about the I gotta that both writers and readers experience, where nothing else matters because I gotta finish writing this section, or I gotta keep reading to find out what happens. And he also starts to realize that he was never writing this book for Annie, and says, the minute you start to write, all those people are at the other end of the galaxy or something. It was never for my ex-wives or my mother or my father. The real reason authors almost always put a dedication on a book, Annie, is because their selfishness even horrifies themselves in the end. However, I wouldn't call it selfish. And I wouldn't say. If a writer is writing a book just for the sake of someone else, like how can it be any good? I think an artist does their best work when they're doing it for themselves. Even if you're doing it with the intent of it being a gift, like you're truly doing it for yourself in a lot of ways. And I think that's how you create something incredible. In the movie, we see that he is on a roll writing, but we never feel that it saves him mentally, only that it saves him from being killed by Annie. In the end of the book, when he burns Misery's Return, he tricks Annie and he doesn't actually burn it, just leads her to believe he has. He had put the real manuscript under his bed, and he truly feels it is his best work, and when he escapes, he publishes the book. It, of course, is a huge success because it brings Misery back to life, but also because people are fascinated by the circumstances under which it was written. In the movie, he doesn't save the manuscript and apparently does really burn it, I guess. And in the end, he does publish a book, but it's not Misery's Return. It's like some other book. And apparently it's like a real book, not the romance trash that his Misery books had been. And something else with the book, it had sections from Misery's Return, which I hadn't expected, but for the most part, I enjoyed those bits. The way it was printed is cool because it's written in a different font from the rest of the book. So it's written in like typewriter font, except for the ends, which make it look like it's handwritten in because the typewriter doesn't have an N. And then later in the book, the T also falls out of the typewriter. So then in those sections, like the N's and the T's are in a different font, and it looks like handwriting. So that was a really nice touch. This other section I want to talk about, I'm going to say the name wrong, but Paul says often in the book that he is Scheherazade, protecting himself against Annie. But near the end, a reoccurring line is, you are Scheherazade to yourself. And Scheherazade is from Arabian Nights. She is a woman who knows she will be killed in the morning, and so she starts telling a story, and she keeps the king interested enough that he keeps putting off her death. And then it's been 1,001 nights, and she has told 1,000 stories, and she has no more, but at this point, the king has decided not to kill her at all. And so Paul initially compares himself to her because, like, he's writing Misery's Return, and it's the story that is keeping him alive. But he also comes to realize that the story was saving himself, too. And so that's why he says, you are Scheherazade to yourself. Though also in the book, it talks about how writing Misery's Return held him back from trying to escape. So I guess maybe, I don't know, kind of a double-edged sword, I suppose. But onto the police. In the movie, there is only one cop, and that is Buster. In the book, we never see the cops' personal lives, but I do like that the movie includes things from his perspective. The scenes with Paul and Annie can be pretty heavy, so it's nice to, lighten things up with seeing the banter of Buster and his wife, and also just seeing how he is piecing things together. In the movie, he goes through these old newspapers to learn about Annie's past, whereas in the book, everybody in the town still fully remembered what she had been tried for, and they still distrusted her and avoided her. In the book, a cop first appears at her house because she has forgotten to pay bills, and they are putting a lien on her house, and this is what Paul gives her the $400 for. Later, a second young cop comes doing a routine check asking about Paul. Annie doesn't see him first because she's like out back working on something, and Paul sees the cop approaching, and so Paul breaks the window and he yells and gets the cop's attention, and the cop sees him and he looks down at the picture of Paul he is holding and realizes that it's him. However, Annie then appears holding a wooden stake that she had been going to put into the ground, and she attacks the man. He is then lying on the ground, seemingly dead, but then he starts to crawl to get his gun. Annie is approaching, sitting on her lawnmower, and Paul shouts to warn the man, but it is too late and he is killed. When this happens, it says, Paul felt a terrible aching sympathy for this unnamed young man, but there was another emotion mixed with that. He examined it and was not too surprised to find it was envy. The trooper would never go home to his wife and kids if he had them, but on the other hand, he had escaped Annie Wilkes. After this, Annie goes to work cleaning up the mess, and this is when she puts him in the basement. She tells him that she has no choice, and at this point she must kill him and then herself. But he convinces her to let him finish Misery's return, after which he accepts that they must die. He tells her he needs just 5 more days, during which time 2 cops come and ask about the trooper. They leave, and when they leave, she tells Paul he needs to finish the book sooner because the next time they come back, they're going to have a search warrant. Also, news spreads of the missing trooper, and word gets out that Annie was one of the last people he saw. And so Annie starts getting visits not just by the police, but also by like some local news anchor comes by, and then random people will drive by and shout at her, calling her Dragon Lady. In the movie, Buster comes by the house because he suspects Annie, and he is like snooping around her house while she's in the kitchen, but things seem normal. She had put Paul in the basement during this time and had drugged him so that he would be quiet. When Buster walks out the door, though, Paul is awake enough to make something fall in the basement, which Buster hears. He goes back inside and hears Paul calling from the basement. He opens the door and he and Paul make eye contact, but then he's shot from behind by Annie. And then the same thing happens where she tells him she needs to kill him and herself, but he says to wait till dawn because by then the book will be done. So on to his escape. In the movie, one of his attempts to escape is by getting the Norville tablets, the medicine, and putting the powder in her wine. This doesn't work, though, because she ends up tipping over the wine. In the book, this doesn't happen. He thinks about it, but the pills are so bitter, he says there's no way she wouldn't notice. In the movie, he also stops taking the Norville. The book, though, he was addicted to the pills. Like, not only was the pain so bad that he had to have them, but he also just realizes that he's just become a Norville junkie. In the book and movie, he escapes the room, and while he's out that first time, he gets more pills from the bathroom. In the book, like this was the whole reason he left the room. She had just slammed his knee and he was in incredible pain. And so he went to go get pills because he just couldn't take the pain. Whereas in the movie, he had stopped taking the pills. So I was confused why he decided to steal them, because in that scenario, it didn't make sense. But I guess he was stealing them so that he could turn them into powder and give them to her, I guess is why. But in the book and movie, his escape plan is the same. Burning Misery's return, though in the book he doesn't truly burn it. And he assumed that Annie would be crazy enough to pick up the burning manuscript, which she is, and she does. And while bent down, he hits her with the heavy typewriter. In the book, it is a bit more graphic with just the whole scene. But in the movie, he crawls out of the room and you think she's dead, but then suddenly she grabs at him one last time. In the movie, she does officially die. And we don't see him getting rescued, but we can assume that someone will soon show up and save him. Whereas in the book, Army crawls out of the room and again, she makes that last grab when he thought she had been dead. And then, she stays in the bedroom though, and he's able to shut the door and lock her in there. He then locks himself in the bathroom where he gets more Norville and he kind of knocks out due to the fatigue. As he is in the bathroom, in the morning, he's scared that when he leaves the bathroom, he will see that she is still alive and out there waiting to kill him. However, he makes his way into the living room, went out there, and she's not there. And once he's out there, the 2 cops that had shown up earlier return and find him inside. And this scene was one of the parts that made me teary when I read it. The officer who finds him is named Wilkes, but Paul had thought of him and his partner as David and Goliath. And so Wilkes, aka David, is the one who finds Paul, and it reads, Wilkes paused for a moment, wanting to better express how it had been, the conflicting emotions he had felt. Horror and pity, and sorrow and disgust. Most of all, wonder that a man who looked this bad should still be alive. He could not find the words. When he saw us, he started to cry, Wilkes said, and finally added, he kept calling me David. I don't know why. Paul tells them that Annie is in the locked bedroom, and they go to check and then come back and tell him that the room is empty. From here, we are taken into the future, 6 months or a year or something. And this section is great for multiple reasons, but one of which is because the reader is left to assume that Annie is still alive out there somewhere. However, near the very end, it is revealed that she was officially found dead out in the barn with her hands holding a chainsaw, which she intended to bring back into the house. But prior to his plan of escape, he is realizing how at a certain point he had stopped thinking of escaping. He recalls a conversation he had with a friend about Jewish people in Europe and asking why didn't they leave when they could see that things were getting bad. And the friend replied that a lot of Jewish people had pianos, and pianos are hard to move. Meaning, like, when the threat isn't great enough, we find reasons to stay. Just like an addict finds reasons not to kick the addiction. So it's these pianos, metaphorical pianos, that in the long run don't even matter, and yet we make ourselves believe they do matter. And Paul realizes that writing Misery's Return was his piano and what kept him from trying to escape. And there is a line about him putting off the idea of escape reading, "He had given up the idea of escape. Only for the time being," his troubled mind protested. "No," a deeper voice responded implacably. "Forever, Paul, forever. I will never give up," he whispered. "Do you hear me? Never." "Oh no?" the voice of the cynic whispered sardonically. "Well, we'll see, won't we?" And this line is also very similar to the thoughts people with addiction have, telling themselves that they will never give up trying, and yet there's that addicted voice in their head that wants them to feel doubt. And so after his escape, in the movie, after he escapes, he is meeting, like the last scene we see is he's meeting with his agent. And as they're eating lunch or whatever, he sees a woman that resembles Annie approach him, and she tells him that she is his #1 fan, and then it ends there. In the book, it also talks about how he will hallucinate Annie, and it also says how since Misery's Return, he hasn't been able to write anything else. He mentions how part of him misses being at Annie's because she had the strong medicine, for one, whereas the doctors here were making him take like just a strong Advil, but that was nothing compared to the Norval. When he goes about his life, he says, "This is why no one writes it. It's too dreary. I should have died then." I'm sure getting sober can at times seem boring compared to life in addiction, which is a roller coaster ride, even when it is misery. And also, even misery is such a powerful and intense emotion. And so to go from feeling these intense emotions to just daily life, it's just can be a challenge to adjust to just the more mundane life. But of course, in the end, for an addict, sober life is real life. And that's living, is when you're sober, rather than being held hostage by this addiction. But in the end of the book, he recalls something he had seen when he was on his walk that had intrigued him. And this ends up spurring an idea for a story for the first time since he had escaped Annie's, because as I said, he had published Misery's Return and then he just wasn't feeling that fire anymore. But he starts writing, and once again, it just shows the magic of it. And it says, "In gratitude and in terror, he wrote. The hole opened and Paul stared through at what was there, unaware that his fingers were picking up speed, unaware that his aching legs were 50 blocks away, unaware that he was weeping as he wrote." And this was the second time in the book that I cried, and it was just such a perfect, touching ending. So just some quick final thoughts. In the movie, he talks about a daughter, but in the book, there is no mention of children. We also never see things from his agent's perspective the way we do in the movie. And by the way, the agent is played by the legendary Lauren Bacall. In the book, as far as addiction goes, once again, in the book, we also learned that he drank a lot of alcohol, basically. And when he got in the crash in the beginning, he was drunk driving. In the book, it also mentions a hotel nearby, and it says, "It was a famous old hotel called the Overlook. It burned down 10 years ago. The caretaker burned it down. He was crazy. Everybody in town said so. But never mind, he's dead." And this is, of course, reference to the Stephen King classic The Shining, which I have yet to read. The movie also has this whole thing about like the penguin facing south or north or whatever it was. In the book, the ceramic penguin is frequently mentioned. However, what clued her into the fact that he had been out of the room was the scrapes of his wheelchair in the door frame, not the penguin. And Stephen King loved Bates' performance so much, he wrote Dolores Claiborne with her in mind, as well as a character in The Stand. And I do plan on covering Dolores Claiborne. It probably won't be for a little while, though. And there was a Broadway version of Misery, which starred Bruce Willis as Paul, and I think he is a great fit. Laurie Metcalf played Annie, and although she's a good actress, I think she is far too frail looking to play a woman like Annie. And then finally, in 1999, Stephen King was hit by a car, and he had to be in a wheelchair as he finished writing his book On Writing. So yeah, when I was reading about that, his situation, his injuries, I guess, were very reminiscent to Paul's injury, because he had hip problems and whatever. So I'm sure that must have been kind of weird for him, maybe. But there's a lot I could go into, but I think I've covered all the big stuff. So going into the book or movie, when I was starting the movie, I was just so excited to watch it because, like I said, it had been so long. And I expected that in the end, I would have a hard time picking a favorite. However, even though the movie is a great adaptation, I can easily say that the book for sure wins. We just get such a deep look into Paul in a way that only books can do. And I also really like how much the book was about writing and the power of it, as I said, and just the power of creativity and art in general. And I also love the ending of the book when he is saved, but also just that last scene when he starts writing a new book. It's just so beautiful. And like I said, it's just such an inspirational story. Yeah, it's also just like really gripping and gruesome, but gratifying. And because I have more of a personal connection with addiction, I also really appreciated that aspect of it. And this will not be the last Stephen King that we talk about here at Why the Book Wins. I won't cover his more scary stories, like I said, but his more suspense thrillers I'll be talking about at some point on here. And if there's any Stephen King fans out there that have a recommendation for someone who does not like being super scared, then I would love to hear it. And if you have any thoughts on this podcast episode, I would love for you to leave a comment on my YouTube video for it, or you could comment on my blog over at Why the Book Wins. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. Yeah, join me next week where I have a guest, and we are going to be talking about the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. Thanks again for listening. If you want to find me on other platforms, you can check out my Facebook, so facebook.com/whythebookwins, or my Instagram, which is all one word, whythebookwins, or you can go to my website, whythebookwins.com. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can reach out to me on any of those. I also have a Buy Me a Coffee account where you can show your support by donating a couple bucks to the podcast. So that's buymeacoffee.com/whythebookwins. But the fact that you are simply listening to the podcast means a lot to me, and I really appreciate it. And don't forget to subscribe and follow and tune in next Wednesday for the latest episode of Why the Book Wins.